This week's Dark Side of the Ring was all about, in this man's opinion, the greatest female wrestling manager of all time. Former Women's World Champion, Sensational Sherri Martel, who left this world far too soon at the age of 49. And I always felt her death was kind of overlooked because she died less than 10 days before the Benoit murder-suicide. So that was just a really bad month. It was a rough watch, especially the last few minutes with her family. It kind of hit you right in the feels. But I also learned more about her personal life than I ever really knew and realized, as far as just how much she put her career ahead of her family. And that came at the expense of her son, who was the most powerful part of the entire episode. I also had no idea that Jake Roberts and Sherri Martel had a fling in real life. I don't know why I'm only first learning of this now, but that must have been wild. Jim Cornette was a great person to hear from because Sherri was the first person that he ever managed. They got thrown together in 1982 when Cornette was just starting out and Sherri was still a rookie. And as he said here in the episode, they bonded because she was greener than goose shit and he was worse. They interviewed Sherri's best friend, Kathy Fitzpatrick, who said that she was a badass in the ring and a sweetheart outside of it. She grew up without a father. Her mother would take her to wrestling shows in Mississippi. And when Jake met her, he was a referee for Mid-South Wrestling, and he would see Sherri in the front row. And they were on again, off again for about 5 years. She wanted to become a wrestler. She went to Jake's dad, Grizzly Smith, who said that she was too young to wrestle and come back when you're 21. She was only 16 at the time. I guess she was a little too old for Grizz. If she was 10 or 11, that would have been more in his wheelhouse, although still maybe a little on the older side. So they interviewed her first husband, Leroy Gonzalez. Sherri was into drugs even back then. She was always big into marijuana. That's what led to her getting fired years later by WWE. You know, it's funny, today, it wouldn't even be an issue. I mean, they literally marketed merchandise for Matt Riddle based around 420 and had him wear it on television. They had it on WWE Shop. It's just a different world now. Back then, they tested for it. And she failed so many times that she ended up losing her job because of it. But the way he was talking, it sounds like she was into more than just marijuana. But she wanted to start a family. And so they had a son named Jared in 1978. He said that he told Sherri at that point, okay, you wanted a child, you got one. Now it's time to put your big girl pants on and take care of the kid. But she couldn't take it. She ended up leaving Leroy to pursue a career in wrestling, which she still badly wanted to do, so she up and left her family. She had a kid and then left when her son was only 3 months old, which is a horribly shitty thing to do. I didn't know about any of this. You know, people make decisions in life that they feel they need to make, and I understand that people make sacrifices for their careers, especially wrestlers, but to say that you want to start a family and have a kid, and then you do, and then you leave that child, I feel bad for the kid. You know, they have no say in any of that, but they end up having to bear the consequences of that. So Sherri moves to Memphis. She ends up going back to Grizzly after she turned 21 and said she already had a son and got divorced. I'm ready. And he said, okay. And they got Rockin' Robin here to be interviewed for this episode, Jake's sister, who worked with Sherri on the road, many matches the two of them had. She's the one who defeated Sherri to win the Women's World title in WWE, WWF at the time. But before all of that, Grizzly tells Sherri, you know, you need to go to the fabulous Moolah, the not-so-fabulous Moolah, for more training. And Sherri did not last long there because Moolah was very strict about curfews and following the rules, and Sherri did none of those things. But Moolah still saw something in her, and she got Sherri booked on a tour of Japan. Meanwhile, Sherri's first husband hires a private investigator to find her, to try to get her to come home and help take care of her son. Until one day, 3 men walk up to this guy, and they tell him, leave Sherri alone because, quote, she belongs to us. And to this day, he has no idea if they were wrestlers or who they were affiliated with, but he got the message. You only have to say once. And he left her alone after that. She found her biggest success up to that point working for the AWA. Vern Gagne was one of the promoters who did not have a relationship with Moolah, which was good for Sherri because he would book women outside of Moolah's crew. And Moolah always got a kickback from her women, and I mean, she totally screwed so many of them over. So he didn't have that issue in the AWA, so that's where Sherri went. And that's when we are introduced to Medusa as one of the talking heads. And she said that she looked up to Sherri and tried to emulate her. She was very young at the time, very green when she first started working against Sherri. And then we're introduced to Sherri's son, Jared. And it is very clear that Jared, from looking at him here in the episode, Jared is not well. He looks very frail. He has difficulty speaking. He's a little hard to understand. Kathy, Sherri's friend, says that she thinks he has cancer, although he's never actually come out and told her that. But we find out that he has had part of his tongue cut out due to cancer, which would explain his difficulty speaking. But he clearly loved his mom, and he shows off old photos of her and says that he was always taken care of and that she made sure of it. And he was in good hands with the people who took care of him, his stepmother. He was 3 years old when he was finally told who his mother was, and they made arrangements for him to spend a week with her. And she sent him back after only 2 days. He was supposed to be there for a week. After 2 days, back he went. And he admitted that he's still angry about that. Jesse Ventura is the one who put a word in for her with Vince McMahon. He and Sherri had met up at a celebrity golf event. And Vince brought her in. And Sherri was the AWA Women's Champion at the time. She felt that she was being underpaid. Vern wanted to sign her to a new deal. She resisted. So she went to the WWF and only weeks later ended Moolah's final run as the Women's Champion in 1987. She beat her for the belt. And a few days after that, the AWA stripped her of their title. The win over Moolah, that was the peak of Sherri's in-ring career. Jake says that Sherri was an emotional wreck, but didn't let anybody know it. Carried a lot of baggage. They considered her to be one of the boys, though, which was the ultimate compliment that you could be paid back then as a women's wrestler, that you're one of us. Rockin' Robin said that Sherri could drink or snort any of the male wrestlers under the table. I guess that's a compliment. But it's probably also why so many of them never lived to see their 50th birthday. Medusa said that Sherri loved her pot and mixed it with alcohol and cocaine. And see, that's when it becomes a problem. When you mix that shit together and you go out to the ring, you know, you're putting your opponent in the danger zone. You don't want to be doing that. And one night in the ring, she kicked Rockin' Robin so hard in the throat that she couldn't breathe and she thought she was going to die. But before long, Vince McMahon decides he's had enough of women's wrestling. It's not drawing any money for him, and he retires the title. And he gets rid of the division. Not the last time he would do that, by the way. But he still wanted to use Sherri because she was such a great personality. She could talk. He wanted to make sure he was able to use her in some meaningful way. And so he made her the manager for some of his biggest stars. And as Jim Cornette says in the episode, you can be the women's world champion and make money, or you can be the manager for a main event male talent in WWE and make a fortune. And this is my earliest memory of Sherri Martel. Even before they put her with the Macho Man Randy Savage, while she was still wrestling as Sensational Sherri, she played the role of Peggy Sue, managing the Honky Tonk Man. He would come out to the ring with Jimmy Hart and Peggy Sue. Most people watching didn't know that it was her. I didn't know who she was at the time, but my very first wrestling show I ever attended was at Madison Square Garden. It was the day after Christmas, 1987. She was the women's world champion at the time. She defended the title against Rockin' Robin that night. Now, I have no memory of the match itself, only the main event. But she came back out at the end of the show dressed as Peggy Sue for Honky's title match against Randy Savage. So I got to see Sherri twice at my very first wrestling show and didn't even know it. But after Vince phased out the women's division, she managed Randy Savage. And Elizabeth is the one who told her, look, I'm going home. You're going to be working with Randy from now on. And Sherri asked her, are you okay with me working with your husband? And Liz said yes. You know, Sherri once said that she did the same thing when she found out she was going to be managing Ted DiBiase. She called his wife to make sure that she was okay with her working with her husband. But after Savage became the Macho King, she became Sensational Queen Sherri. And she was there for some of the biggest matches back then in that late 80s period. The SummerSlam 89 main event with Hulk Hogan and Brutus Beefcake against Zeus and the Macho King. One of the all-time great moments after the match with Elizabeth whacking Sherri in the head with the loaded purse and Tony Schiavone losing his mind on commentary. The Royal Rumble in 1991 when the Ultimate Warrior lost the WWF title to Sergeant Slaughter. You know, when the Warrior lost the title that night, it was Sherri and Savage interfering in that match that resulted directly in costing him the championship. Warrior, at one point, he gorilla pressed Sherri over his head and launched her into the aisleway right onto Savage, which they showed here in the episode. Later on, you know, when she was managing Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty returned after a year away, Sherri got clobbered with the giant mirror, the giant heart-shaped mirror that she used to bring to the ring. She would carry around for Shawn to look at himself in. She got hit in the head with the mirror and glass went everywhere. Yeah, the thing with Sherri that made her so great is really the same thing that made Bobby Heenan so great. They were both very physical and they took bumps because both of them were trained wrestlers. You know, when Bobby started in the business, he was a wrestler when he first broke in. Sherri was a wrestler when she first broke in. And even after that, she wasn't afraid to take bumps and do what was needed to make the angle work or to make the other person look good. When Savage and Warrior, they had their career-ending match at WrestleMania 7. After Savage lost, Sherri got in the ring and she just started laying into him. And she had been managing him for 2 years. She started kicking the crap out of him. She lost her meal ticket. She was furious. And this led to Elizabeth, who had been away. She was probably off TV for at least a year, if not longer. They showed her sitting in the crowd watching the match. When the match was over and she saw what was happening to Randy, she jumps the barricade, climbs into the ring, throws Sherri out to the floor. And then we got the reunion of the Macho Man and Elizabeth. And still to this day and forever, one of my all-time favorite stories in wrestling. Sherri was a key part of that. And it makes me very sad that all 4 people involved in that angle that night are now dead. 5, if you count the referee, because it was Dave Hebner in the ring that night. And both announcers as well, because Gorilla and Bobby were on the call. Fuck, now I'm depressed. Jared says that if he ever opened his mouth and told everybody the things that he saw, he's sure that he would not have been allowed to go back and see his mom. He says he isn't even sure he ever saw his mother sober. That's a scary statement. But she found ways to deal with the pain that her body was racked with through somas, which were muscle relaxers, which were in high supply back then, especially to wrestlers. After her time with Savage, they had her managing DiBiase, then Shawn Michaels, who in past interviews has said that Sherri really looked out for him when he first went single. There were guys that wouldn't want to sell for him. They wouldn't want to make him look good. Sherri would see this and would tell him, hey, throw him outside the ring. And Shawn would throw the person outside the ring. And then behind the referee's back, she would kick the shit out of him. But for real, like she would lay those shots in. She really tried to help him. And I know Shawn has always been very complimentary towards her for it. And Sherri and Shawn, they had already worked together years earlier in the AWA. When the Midnight Rockers feuded with Playboy Buddy Rose and Doug Summers, Sherri managed Rose and Summers. So it wasn't like, you know, that was their first time working together. One of Sherri's greatest contributions to the wrestling business was singing Shawn Michaels' theme song. She did the vocals for the first version of his Sexy Boy theme. And then after she split from him, Vince McMahon asked Jimmy Hart if he could get Shawn in studio to sing the song himself. And for years, I thought that moaning at the beginning of the song was still Sherri's voice. Like even in the second theme. You know, that they just did a little bit of editing to make it sound different. Jimmy, though, said in an interview years ago, this was after Legends House came out, he did an interview and said that it was actually him and Shawn together. So if you ever wondered who that female-sounding voice is moaning for Shawn Michaels at the beginning of the song, that would be Jimmy Hart. The Ageless Wonder. Unfortunately, Sherri failed a bunch of times for marijuana at a time when Vince was testing for it and they let her go. Cornette says back then there was no sending you to rehab, you were just fired. And that came in the middle of her feud with Luna Vachon, which really never got a chance to go anywhere. That's why it ended so abruptly. She ended up in WCW, managing Ric Flair for his feuds with Hulk Hogan and Sting, and then with Harlem Heat, she managed them to 7 out of their 10 WCW tag team titles. But I know Booker and Stevie, they love Sherri. They always speak very highly of her. They've acknowledged many times how important she was to their careers. Even just recently, I saw WWE, they have a new season out of Most Wanted Treasures on A&E, and they did a WCW episode. That was the season opener. Booker and Stevie are in it, and they were praising Sherri for all that she did for them. She even worked on their gear. And they still have the gear. Their tights with the flames going down the sides. That was Sherri's work. Now, one thing you may not know is that there were plans in WCW for Sherri to manage a young Triple H and William Regal as the original Blue Bloods. Triple H played Jean-Paul Levesque at the time, but he ended up leaving for WWE, so it never materialized. Ultimately, her run in WCW ended because she was all fucked up on what Eric Bischoff thinks were prescription meds, and it was affecting her performance on screen, so he let her go. Medusa says that she has no issue with Bischoff firing her for drug use, but says that should have been done twofold on a handful of men in the company as well. And you know what? She's got a point there. Think of all the men throughout that late 90s period who I'm sure were all fucked up and kept their jobs, probably more out of who they were friends with than anything else. After WCW, Sherri was in her 40s. The focus was on younger women in the business. She had no place to go. She did come back very briefly in 2000 in WCW. It was a couple of matches, one against Medusa, one against the young Molly Holly. As the years went on, Jake heard through the grapevine that she was hooked on Oxy. I'm sure Jake was well plugged into that grapevine, especially back then. WWE brought her in for a cameo on SmackDown. This is a famous cameo in the build-up to the Shawn Michaels Kurt Angle match at WrestleMania 21. Kurt was going back into Shawn's past. Anything you can do, I can do better. He came out. He brought Sherri out to the ring with him. He sang his own version of Sexy Boy. It became Sexy Kurt. The following year, she was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, which was also the last time that her son ever got to see her. She was only the second woman ever inducted after Moolah. She stole the show that year. I still remember her shouting down a heckler in the crowd during her speech. Later that same year, she made one appearance for TNA, scouting Bobby Roode, and she was hoping that she would be brought back, and that ended up being her last televised appearance. Sherri was beat up. I mean, she was very beat up. She had very bad back problems, which is probably a good part of the reason why she was self-medicating. Her friend said that just before she died, might have been the night before, Sherri was on the phone with her and was very upbeat and said she had some news to share with her, but she didn't want to jinx it. But the plan she heard was that WWE was going to bring Sherri back. And they were going to pay for the surgery to get her back fixed, and they were going to have her train the women. I think Sherri would have been an amazing trainer. Cornette says that he knows she wanted to go back. He's less sure of how receptive the company would have been to the idea. I don't know that Cornette was working there at that point. When did Cornette get fired? It was probably about 05 or 06. So Cornette may not have had any direct ties or been working for WWE by that point, but he's not sure how receptive they would have been to that. He's not sure how accurate that is. Would she have been able to stay clean? I don't know. And remember, that was the same year as the Signature Pharmacy scandal, 2007. So I think there would have been less tolerance for any failed drug tests after that scandal broke. You know, the slightest infraction, one failed test, and that could have been the end of her. Who knows how that would have worked out? We'll never know. But she sounded hopeful. And then came June 15th, 2007. Sherri and her husband, they lived next door to Sherri's mom. She was sitting outside with her mom on her mom's porch and collapsed in her rocking chair. Her cause of death was ruled an accidental drug overdose. She had multiple drugs in her system, something like 5 or 6 at least, including a very high amount of oxycodone. Jared gets a phone call telling him that his mother passed away. Jake says his sister is the one who told him, and he immediately got in his car and drove all the way to Alabama to be at the funeral. Jake Roberts, Marty Jannetty, Booker T, and Sharmell were the only wrestlers who attended the funeral. And it was reported at the time that Vince McMahon, to his credit, paid for the funeral. Booker T and Sharmell, they paid for Sherri's headstone. In the episode, her son shared letters that his mom wrote to him over the years, which was very cool to see. He said his mom and stepmom, they loved each other. And we got the stepmom, Pat, on camera in tears, talking about what a great woman Sherri was and how awesome she was. And Jared said that Sherri could not have picked a better person to raise him and look after him. Jared's stepmom, again, the sight of her standing beside him, tears in her eyes, and saying that Jared is her everything. And then he said, Sherri was my mother, but this was her tag team partner. This was just gut-wrenching to watch. And they ended with a clip from an interview that Sherri did, in her own words, where she says, I sacrificed so much of my life, my family time. I would like to know the mistakes I made. People won't remember me so much for those, but for the good that I tried to do. I hope people will look back and maybe learn something from my mistakes. And there's a common theme to these dark side shows when it comes to the effect that drugs and alcohol have on so many of these people. Sherri's case was especially sad because I know she was in a lot of pain near the end of her life and she wanted to get her back fixed. She never had that chance. And I don't know if doing so would have alleviated those drug issues. I also didn't know about the way that she just up and left her family to pursue wrestling. They were very forgiving of her, though. And Sherri, in the last interview that she ever did, admitted that she made a lot of mistakes, and she hoped that people might learn from those mistakes. And I think that's a good takeaway from the episode. She gets credit for her work, but not enough of it. I don't think she gets enough credit for her work as a manager. She's the greatest female manager of all time, and one of the greatest managers of all time, period. I don't have her in my top 3 all-time managers, but she's pretty high up on the list. And when WWE announced the Fabulous Moolah Memorial Battle Royal for WrestleMania 34, which blew up and backfired in their face, they got a ton of backlash for that, for obvious reasons, and they just renamed it to some generic-sounding name. But at the time, I suggested, why not call it the Sensational Invitational and make it an annual thing? They don't do women's battle royals anymore for WrestleMania. I mean, even the men's, they bumped the Andre Battle Royal to SmackDown. But if they ever revisit the idea, I think that would make for a fitting name.